There's a magic that can be found when you take the time to learn how other successful people, make it happen in other industries and other endeavors besides just the one you're in. Like one of the things I really like to do is study how other people are successful in whether they're industries or in this particular case, athletics. Because I don't think that there's any place in the world that you see world class more than you see in different types of athletics, right? And these successes, they leave clues. And if you look closely, there's a lot you can learn from other people who are doing amazing things, world-class things, elite things. And I try to spend a lot of time trying to learn from other industries, other endeavors, and what could we take from that and apply in our own life and our own endeavors. And as I said, I think this is very, very true in sports. High performance athletes talk about how they succeed. And so often it's their mindset and it's the tools that they use that we can take as entrepreneurs and use that to both grow our business and the life that we want to live. So to help us really understand what goes into be elite and world class, we have Ben Sporer here today with us. He's going to give us some lessons that entrepreneurs can take from elite athletes. And by the way, he literally wrote the book on the topic, and it's a great book, by the way. I'd highly recommend it. Ben Sporer, PhD, has spent nearly 3 decades working in elite sport and human performance. He's held multiple roles within the Canadian Sports Institute. He's an accomplished psychologist. He's led performance events. He's done the support teams at Summer and Winter Olympic Games, World Cup, World Championship events. I could go on and on here. In addition to his role as founder of Resync, a boutique performance strategy firm for sports organizations, athletes, and corporate clients, Ben is an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia and is currently the vice president of performance strategy for the Vancouver Whitecaps and of Major League Soccer. He's the author of a new book, Output: Optimizing Your Performance with Lessons Learned from Sport. And he uses some scientific expertise with his experience and something he calls the core 4 performance factors, which we're going to talk about. So, Ben, welcome to Turning the Page.
Chris, thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So let's start right at the beginning, Ben. Let's tell us your story. How did you get here?
Well, I'll give you the quick Coles notes of it. I'm a physiologist by training. I did my undergrad, master's, and a PhD in physiology, primarily exercise physiology. And I started working in sport right off the bat, even when I was in undergrad. That was my introduction to performance. I've always been a fan of human performance from sport primarily. Right. And then as I progressed through my career, I eventually started moving into areas of working with coaches and high performance directors, right, and starting to ask questions about what drives the performance. And to really help support coaches and athletes, we really drove into what are those unique factors that drive performance. And I'd say over the course of that career, I've more transitioned into some that work still as a physiologist practicing, but also really driving performance strategy for both individuals, athletes, executives, business people, and teams and organizations.
Wow. So you must have learned a lot over these years, especially working with elite athletes. That must be quite a thing. What do you find separates an elite athlete from everyone who's just trying out there? I'm sure that there's some, they have to have some natural abilities and, some given gifts. That's a good starting place. But what else do you see?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a number of things, obviously, and you highlight a few of them. You have to have some great natural abilities and gifts, and you can't be a center in the NBA if you're 5'5". It just doesn't happen. So no matter how much you might want to be or prepare to be, it just likely isn't going to happen. So obviously there's those innate things that you're born with, but the thing that really separates those who perform it and optimize their ability to perform are some of those traits that really take strategic approaches to understanding what it is that is required to achieve their objective. So when I talk about that, I say, we often look at performance or high performers as outcome-based. And really what I find with the elite are those who are able to understand what's required to increase the likelihood they can achieve that outcome. And they focus on that.
Interesting. So I guess that's where we come to your new book, Output: Optimizing Your Performance with Lessons Learned from Sports. So I was really interested in this whole concept of the core 4 performance factors. I thought that was fascinating. So maybe for our audience who haven't read the book, and they should, maybe talk a little bit about what those core four are and how they affect performance.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think all performances, whether they be an elite sport or whether you're an entertainer or a business person, there's a lot of things that help make that performance happen. Some of it's preparation, some of it's, but there's also there's so many different attributes that relate to that performance when you get on stage or you go into a negotiation or you stand at the top of a ski run.
Right.
And so people often get overwhelmed. And the concept of the core four was really driven by a mentor of mine back in my master's degree, Dr. Howie Winger. He talked about the gears of performance. And it was a way to simplify the aspects of performance and all those attributes that lead to a performance into four main categories.
Right.
And if you actually think about it, when you go through any performance, you'll find that they can be broken down into four different areas: technical, tactical, physical, and mental. So whether you're a business person or you're an athlete, when you have to perform in that moment, your performance is a combination of all those different factors. It's not just one or the other.
Right. And so maybe expand upon, let's start with the first one. What does that mean, and how would somebody use that, in their own life?
Yeah. So from a technical perspective, I can go through each one of them, and I think a good
That would be great.
Let's we'll use an example that's probably relevant to your listeners. Is let's say you're working in an investment industry and you have to close a big deal. Right. Your objective is to really achieve these numbers. Let's say it's $1 million of revenue or whatever it might be. Well, there's a couple things that have to required. If you don't have the technical skill set to be able to make that deal with the client work or to understand the nuances of that deal, you need a certain level of technical skill to deliver on that performance, either in the moment or over the course of a year. At the same time, you need a certain level of tactical skills. So you have to understand what's your strategy to approach that. How are you going to go about getting sales? How are you recruiting clients? How do you negotiate certain deals? There's a mental component to that. When you're under pressure, how do you handle the pressure? How do you deal with the things that are outside of that moment that may not be related to that deal, but might be family related?
Right.
You've got some stress at family. You've got a sick family member. You've got kids that stay up all night. And believe it or not, and many people think this, is there's actually a physical component to it. And this is the obvious one in sport, for many reasons, because sport is very physical. But even in a performance such as in an investment advisor or an investment role, when you have a big presentation that comes up, but you've had to fly across the country and you've had very little sleep, how are you able to handle that over a course of, one day, but also a course of series of multiple weeks when you're traveling around the country? You've got to be able to handle the impacts of jet lag and fatigue and injury. So you don't want to be injured. So there are physical components that are just smaller.
Right. And so, what you would do if you wanted to work on these things, you would take each one in isolation and try to, dissect it and work on that. Is that sort of the concept?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, ultimately, the biggest thing is really understanding the very beginning, what's your objective, and being honest about that.
Right.
And so, because the premise, and I talk about this in the book Output, is the premise is that high performers are really good at identifying what's the output that's required to increase their likelihood of success versus an outcome approach. An outcome approach has much to do with things that are in and out of your control. Sport, if you go up against the best competitor in the world and they have all the skill sets, you just can't really control that. You have no control over that.
Right.
You can only control how you prepare. So when you're thinking about how to work on these in isolation, is quite often what people do is they think about these as individual aspects. But in every one of those situations that I provided, there's actually an interplay between all of them. So if you don't have the physical capacity to tolerate the jet lag and the travel, your ability to go into a negotiation session will be compromised. Even if you do have the technical skills, you may not be at your best.
Right.
And vice versa. If you don't have good stress management techniques, or you have anxiety leading into that, you don't know how to handle those. Even if you've got the best technical situation or tactical skill set or approach, you may not be able to address that in the moment. So your performance would not be optimal. And so when you think about this from, say, how do you go about preparing yourself, to your question, do you think about them in isolation? Well, you do have to work on them in isolation, but it's really important to understand what are those gaps, because if you think that you don't have a gap to deliver, you can never deliver in a environment where you go into negotiation, but you don't account to the fact that you're tired all the time.
Right.
That might not, you can work as hard as you want on trying to be a better negotiator, but you may never be able to express that if you're fatigued and exhausted on a regular basis. So you do have to think about these as an interplay. And I use the word integration quite a bit because performance is actually an integrated output of all those different factors that come together.
Yeah. Well, just, as you were talking, I was thinking about, some of the things that I've picked up over the years when I talking with some top performers. And one of the things that can't come out of that is this whole, rest and recuperation, which, athletes have to do, business people have to do, even performers have to do. You can't be on all the time. And to think that you can be on all the time is probably setting yourself up for failure, where you need to almost plan out this downtime, this rest and recuperation type of mindset, and that's hard for some people. And to your point, if that is not, if you're tired, you can't be peak at the other thing. So I see what you're saying from that link.
Absolutely. And we actually see that, and a great example of that in sport. People will relate to this easily. Like, if we're not seeing the performances that we want in a runner, so we continue to push and we continue to train hard, we actually see a decrement in performance. We see performance drop off as they carry more fatigue. They don't get the adaptations that they want. Well, the same thing goes with any other performance. If you're running that, you're burning the candle at both ends and you're continuously draining on that, but you think I need to do more, you actually might need to just be pulling back and you'll have a better performance down the road, as opposed to just being able to you need to put more time in, with more time in. And often when I work with executives, this is quite one of the bigger impacts that I have when I work with individuals from a business perspective is, how do you manage that? How do you put those things back together to then do slight adjustments? And all of a sudden it's like they're performing at a higher level.
Yeah, no, I see that. I deal with executives quite a bit, and as you can imagine, and we have a saying: is the tireder you are, the stupider everybody around you gets. So when you have seen, I heard how stupid everybody is and how dumb everyone is, then you're like, you know what? It's time for you to take a vacation. It's time for you to take 2 to 3 weeks off, because that seems to be a direct correlation of how things fall apart as the actual leader is the one who's tired versus what people are around them doing.
Absolutely. Another point on that is, like, people forget about the physical side, but most executives are, as you become more and more of a leader in an organization, you're usually older. There's as you move through your career, it's just a natural progression. Our leaders are typically older. And one of the things that we see when people are older is that as you get older, you become less fit. There's really only one thing that's been shown to improve the ability to make decision making. It's ability to stay aerobically fit. So as you balance those two things off, as I get older and older and our bigger decision makers are older, we also have this age decreasing in our fitness. And so that combination play, and you start to show that to people and they see the connection and they start to realize, I do need to pay attention to this because it has bigger impacts than I ever would have thought. It's not just about my waistline.
Oh, absolutely. As somebody who, I try to work out almost every day,
I
can tell you the difference between, when I considered being a workaholic, but now if I don't get that hour, I can tell, just even the next day or the day after, that it starts to fall off. So I think you have to, positions like ours, you have to make time to actually be physically fit. You have to actually, because if you leave it to the last thing, it's never going to happen, because it's easy to say, well, I'm just not going to go gym today, but tomorrow that could be a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about prioritization at the end of the day. And I think everybody knows that. One of the things I try to stress in the book, and it's sort of, I think, where and it's this integrated component to it. When you prioritize it as it's actually part of your performance in your workplace, because it actually has a direct impact on your ability to perform over the long haul, that people are able to switch that lens to saying, oh, I don't just need to go work out today.
Right.
This is actually part of my job in a way.
Right. It's one of those non-negotiables, at least. And it took me a long time to get to that point, but now it's such a habit. I need my hour of lifting up heavy things and listening to heavy metal. So
Everybody's got a different way to do it. So that's
readjust everything. And so probably it goes back to, and I got this in your book too, goal setting. Athletes have a particular goal and it's to get better, and there's a process, but you don't always see that same level of, you see goal setting, but you don't see the same level of process in entrepreneurs. So maybe talk a little bit of what you've learned from working with athletes about goal setting and the process to achieve those goals, and how they might be applicable to the entrepreneurs who are listening.
It's a great question, and I think one of the things is that you even mentioned it there, is that athletes, we see them, they set goals. I think just like with entrepreneurs, you see athletes set goals, but they're not the right goals. And so this is one of the things I've experienced over time, and whether it be a sport organization or an individual athlete. I think the lessons that to be learned are, the first and foremost is to be really, really clear about why it's your goal. Right?
Right.
Understand why that's your goal and what that means. I think that we often don't get into the real why. And I know there's a lot of people that talk about why. There's a reason why people talk about that. But as it relates to goal setting in both sport and in business, is on a personal level, is really understand why that's your objective. Is it because someone else wants it, because whatever else thinks it should be, or should be this athlete at the highest level? I think the other thing is be really clear on what that goal is. And so when I talk about that, and I'll ask you this question: if you have a goal of making $1 million of revenue in a year, is that really your goal? Or
Right.
is your goal, if I have the same goal as you to make $1 million of revenue, do we have the same goals? We often think about goals in isolation. You talked about this earlier. We work about silos. But the reality is goals don't exist in isolation. And we see this in sport a lot, is that they actually have to have personal context to them. So
Right.
what is your personal context? You might be I don't know your personal situation, but you might have 5 kids, 2 kids, 1 kid. You might have no kids.
Right.
You might have priorities. So we often think about our business goal. And when I work with people and on the non-sports side, is the first point is really often bringing the personal context to their goal. Well, you actually also want to be a good partner. You want to be a good father. You want to grow your business. But when you think about these goals in isolation, this is where the conflict often happens. And down the road, you can get down that path and people get to a situation where they've thought about it only in the individual context. So bringing personal context is one of the big things.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Because when I think of my own situation, it wasn't, money necessarily that was a motivator. It was freedom. It was the ability to travel, the ability to, make my own hours, call my own shots, and to do that, unfortunately, in today's day and age, you need money to do that. So
For sure.
I can totally see where you're coming from. The other thing that I remember another coach once telling me is, when you write down a goal, the second question you should ask is it worth attaining? Like, because there's going to be a lot of sacrifice that's going to obviously go into achieving that goal. And if you can't clearly articulate why it's important to you, you're probably not going to do what's necessary to get there. And I don't know, do you see that in athletics as well?
Absolutely, all the time. And I've got numerous stories in athletics and even on the personal side. I think often we see people like the idea of being X or achieving X, right? And
Yeah.
I'll give you a simple example of an athlete, and not a specific person, but it goes across the spectrum in every sport, is that there's a lot of people that will desire to be a professional athlete, but they really don't desire what's required to be there. So they like the idea of it, but they don't actually like the process of doing it. And so or they might be very skilled, and so they actually like the idea of taking it to the next level, but they don't really want to be the best performer in the world.
Hmm.
They really are just comfortable with what their skill might take them to. They really enjoy the sport to the level that their skill or their natural abilities might take them to without putting in a lot of work.
Right.
Now, as long as they're honest about what their objective is and their goal is with that, that's great. No problem.
Okay. It's easy. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I'd say they're a high performer. They're relating to what they want to achieve out of it, but they may not be relating to what other people want to achieve out of it, right? And this is where I think the personal context is really important. So you might look at an athlete that says, well, that has so much talent, he never really amounted to anything, or she never really amounted to anything. But that person might have said, I just want to play at a highest level, but I also want to go to school and I want to start my own business in college, and I don't necessarily want to become pro. But so they put the effort that they can to play at the highest level that they can while doing this.
Right.
That's That's a lot harder than just focusing on one thing in some ways. And so I think that's when we go back to the goal setting piece, is be honest about what is your personal context to that goal. And then your ability to judge your performance based on your goal is much more appropriate versus out external validation as to whether you're successful or not.
Yeah, you're making a really good point, because we talk about New Year's resolutions and why they never work, and because usually those are just wish lists versus goals, right? They're like, I wish I would lose weight. I'm not going to do anything about it, but I wish I would, or I wish I would do that. Whereas if somebody in the context says, this is really important to me, if I don't lose weight, I'm going to die, that might be one of them. Then you'll do what is necessary to do that. And we've seen these, and you've probably seen it, these massive transformations when somebody, it just clicks in their head, and within a relatively short period of time, at least my view, there's somebody loses 60 pounds. You're like, I can't lose 5 pounds to save my life, and here's someone losing 60 pounds. So I think what you're saying is, it really, when you get that context and it clicks in your head, it's so much easier to have what you need to do to get there.
Yeah, and I think that you go back to your question about what separates the elite and the high performers. They're really able to connect with why they're doing it, and then they're able to prioritize. And it feels like it's hard work. It doesn't mean it's not hard work, but it becomes much simpler to understand what they need to do, because they're honest about it. And often I find that sometimes when I get called into a sports situation, it's often because they're trying to achieve something, but they're not really honest about what they can or can't achieve, or what they really need to do to achieve that. And they're sort of spinning their wheels at times. And so helping them clarify what it is and what it's really going to require to get there. Sometimes it's just a little switch that needs to be flicked or turned on, and they're off on their own and they're running with it. And it looks like you've worked magic, but really all you've done is reshaped how they perceive it.
Right. Question. Well, that must be very satisfying work for you, because you can probably see some of the people that you've helped clarify those things, and then they're working. And there's nothing where I said I love watching excellence at work, and there's nothing more breathtaking than somebody who is driven, loves what they do, passionate about does it, and puts the work in. It's like the perfect mechanism that you see happening right in front of you.
I love it. Absolutely love it. It's why I do what I do. It's why I stay in this field for so long, and it's fantastic. And I think I equally get enough joy, similar joy, from working with one of the best in the world in a sport as I do with working with someone who's now they've become the best version of themselves that they can actually achieve within their own personal life that they want to achieve, and they're so happy at the end of the day.
Very satisfying work, I'd imagine. Now let's talk about competition, because everything, the one thing that both business and sport have is competition, is, comparing yourself to, another athlete or another business. How does this, sort of come out? How's it different in each sector? But more importantly, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And I always wonder about this, because I hear business people say, never look at the competition, just look at your clients. Don't look at the competition, just focus on, what you need to do. But I don't know, competition does drive people. So what's your viewpoint, and what have you observed?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, it's such an interesting area. I find, I think as a society, we've started to give competition a really bad negative connotation to it. And I think that that's good in some ways. Like, there's good competition and there's bad, or healthy or unhealthy, how you might want to describe it.
Right. I think that would be
one thing I'd say about competition is that, regardless of the field I've worked in, I'd say all high performers are competitive, but not all competitive people are high performers. And why I say that is because, and I think you can, as soon as you say that, you can relate to that, and people you may know in your industry or things that you've seen. Those who focus on unhealthy competition or forms of competition, or focus on competing just to beat someone else, or to, whether it be in sport or in business, get distracted from really focusing on themselves. And I find unhealthy competition is often focused on things that may or may not be out of their control, right? So they're trying to compete with something that they have no control over, and it actually becomes a distraction. It can cause mental health challenges in a lot of different ways. It can cause a lot of anxiety and stress. It can destroy relationships. Healthy competition, I find, is really, really important to be a high performer. You have to be competitive with yourself at the very least, to be able to improve. You have to want to be better. And I find when you find healthy competition, it's most often focused on things that are within your own control. And I use the term output, and hence the title of the book, versus outcomes. That's not to say that the outcome's not important. It is important because that's really related to your objective. But know that you don't have control over your outcomes. They're controlled by both what you do and what other people do. If someone says, I'm deciding not to take that deal with you, Chris, you have no control whether all you can do is do your best and prepare your best to present the rationale why they might.
Right.
Say when you get into that situation and people will say, well, you got to focus on the outcome because we need to beat the competition. Well, you might have to reevaluate what's required to beat the competition. That's your challenge. That's where the competition comes in. It's a growth mindset ability to say, hey, I want to be able to take this on. We didn't quite get it this way. Why didn't we get this way? Let's reflect on that. Let's be better at that.
And that, yeah. I see this. It's really coming clear, this whole concept. Because you talk about, the concept of performance solution. It empowers people to value output over outcome. Whether and you talk in the stage of athletics, but this is also in entrepreneurs. So maybe if you could expand a little bit more about this, value the output versus outcome, because I think it's a really, really important point that people are starting to understand.
Right. Yeah. So the concept of output is when you think about an objective, right, and you want to evaluate your performance, and this is why I use how I originally came to the term of output in that sense, is that performance isn't an outcome. It's actually, when you think about an actor, and the easiest way to describe that, when they go on stage, they do a performance, right? And you might say that was a great performance, and some people might say that was a poor performance. But it's the actions and tasks and things that they do to deliver and achieve an objective. That's really an output. And when you evaluate that, and like in sport, like we prepare and we do all this work, and output's the thing. I'll use soccer, for example, because I'm working in that sport right now. The output's what happens on the field in 90 minutes. A referee could have made a different call that you don't agree with. There could have been a bang, could have put an amazing wall, but their goalie stood on his head, or they just have a better roster than you. But your preparation and your performance should be based on how you are as an individual, or your collective team as an individual, and how well they prepared to deliver required output. So when it comes to goals and objectives, I always help. My goal is to try to facilitate the understanding that your performance is related to how well you prepare yourself to increase the likelihood that you're successful. Right? And your preparation should always be focused on that. So when you think about from a business perspective, right, did you prepare your staff well enough? Did you prepare well enough for that presentation? Did you know the background information well enough? Did you understand your client's needs well enough? Did you practice and rehearse well enough? Are you skilled in certain areas to achieve? And the more that you refine those attributes that are required to achieve that, the more you increase the likelihood you're going to be successful. Doesn't mean you always will be.
Right.
But when you walk out of that room, you can now say, look, we're really comfortable with what we did. We actually analyzed this. We did a great job on this. Ultimately, they want something different. We're good. We can continue to thrive.
Right. But we did our part, and we did it to our best of our ability. And I think you're really onto something. You said you have the goal, you have the importance of the goal and the passion of the goal. And then you have, the output that's necessary, and then the tactics to make sure that output is getting you to where you are. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of an article I read on Steve Jobs, that before his presentations which would look ad lib and look like it's just coming out of he just practiced that day, that he would do 80 different practice runs before he would get on stage, and to perfect that, to your point, output, which was to convince a very large audience or the world in some cases that this product was the best that he was launching. And you can see each thing that you're talking about linking to exactly a person like Steve Jobs, which you would consider a probably one of the best entrepreneurs of all time.
Yeah, and I think everything you highlight there relates to the preparation. He was clear on what he needed to be able to do to deliver the message that got millions of people on board. And he was also clear what the organization needed to do to be able to change and revolutionize an entire industry in multiple area industries. And he prepared himself well enough, and his team well enough, to make sure they will able to execute on that and increase the likelihood that they were successful in doing that.
Yeah, no, it's all coming together now. And now, of course, what happens is the unknown, right? The
Yeah.
setbacks, the failures, the injuries, and this must be like a thing that you deal with all the time, especially in large sports teams like soccer, where injuries and that sort of thing are just a regular part of life. What can entrepreneurs learn from the setbacks and failures of athletes and how they overcome those? And how could they apply that in their business?
Yeah, another great question. I think you can even look to business and say that no matter how many business books you read or podcasts you listen to, you always hear people that were successful and everybody thinks it's a fly over the night. Overnight they went like that, but they're often,
Right.
I had many failures along the way. And the key is, and we see that in sport, like nobody wins every competition they've ever performed at. Nobody is able to be, even when they get to the highest level in an individual sport, like let's call it World Cup downhill mountain bike racing or skiing. They don't, very, very rarely do they just get to the top and they're at the top and they stay there their entire career. They have learnings along the way as they move to that next level of competition, or they move to that next level of business involvement, that they
Right.
have to adapt and learn and grow to be at that high level. And so I think the number one message that comes from that, and what I see in the world's best, is 100% they have a growth mindset. They take each learning, each loss, each failure as not necessarily a failure, but a message, a learning. What did I
Right.
learn? How come I didn't do successful? And they actually, quite often, what you'll see in athletes, the really good ones who are very strategic in how they go about doing this, is they go into an event and they're going to do their best to get the best result they can and potentially even win that. But they compare that result or that performance relative to what they were expecting to get.
Mm.
And if they don't get to that expected value, like I was really expecting to finish fifth because that's
Right.
what my profile is capable of. They say, it's not just the failures. They say, why didn't I get what I expected? Okay, I did everything right. Maybe I didn't really judge what it was required properly, but they evaluate the growth mindset. What did I learn from that? What do I have to do differently? But on the flip side of that, they actually take successes deemed from an outcome perspective. I finished first in that event, but I really wasn't expecting, I shouldn't have finished more than fifth. Why did I finish
Mm.
first? Well, 3 people crashed. The other people didn't perform very well. They don't get a false sense of, I'm actually there. They're honest
Right.
about it. I really didn't deserve to win that. I won on paper, but my output was really like a fifth on any given day.
Mm.
And I think that that's where they have this concept of learning from every sort of performance. How do they take that, whether it be a success or a failure?
Right. Actually, it's funny you said that because I was thinking about sales, and I had a coach way back when, and he used to say after every meeting, ask yourself 3 questions. First question is, what did you think was going to happen? The second question is, what actually happened? Because it's never what you thought was going to happen. And the third question is, what would I do differently next time? And if you can do
Yeah.
that, if you can develop the habit of always asking yourself those 3 questions after every important pitch or every important presentation, within time you will know exactly what works, you will know exactly what doesn't work, and hopefully you will learn from each one of those interactions until you have as close to perfection as you're going to have. But that takes years of monitoring it as opposed to just assumptions. So it's so funny how
Very much so.
you almost said the same thing in athletics in a very different way, but both successes and failures are analyzed in that way so you can learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I read a lot of business books. I read a lot of try to understand the industries, the variety of industries that made people successful. So when I think of performance, I work in high performance sport and I translate some of those lessons over to other groups. But I'm always trying to learn from other people and learn what's been, what other successful people have done and how and why. And I do see those themes coming up over and over and over again, whether they be clients or whether it be a book that I've read or a documentary that I've watched. Those themes do come up over and over again.
Yeah. So if you had to give sort of one piece of advice to an entrepreneur about optimizing performance, what would be the one piece of advice that you'd say, take this one to heart? To your point, there's a lot of things and they're interrelated and all that. But, if you wanted the audience to leave with one sort of, hey, this is the greatest starting point, what do you think that would be?
I'd have to say, without a question, it would be go back to the very beginning, really, really understand your objective and what's the output that's required to achieve it. and be honest about it. Because even when I work in sport, if I go into a sporting organization with an athlete, we always start there. We have to always start there. And quite often what you find is they will say, and here's a really simple one from sport, and I think your readers or your listeners will appreciate it. Like every team in a league, whether it be NHL, MLS, MLB, we want to win the championship. Like,
Sure.
but the reality is there's 30 plus teams. Only one person can win it.
Right.
So if you judge your performance on that, it doesn't mean that you are you're most likely to fail. And
Right.
so I think really getting back to the core of why that's your objective and what's the output that's required to do that helps you articulate where you need to go. It's the starting point of all things. And it allows you to prioritize and actually makes it very simple to prioritize what are the steps you need to do and if you go back to the core four, once you get to that space of saying, okay, this is the output that's required. Now let's evaluate us. Do we have that output that's capable? We have the capability to deliver that output. Because now you start to see holes.
Right.
And identify where you should be spending your time versus where you shouldn't.
Yeah. So what I get out of that is honesty and clarity on your why. If you can have honesty and clarity on your why, all the other pieces should fall into place. Doesn't mean it's not a lot of work, but at least you're honest and you're clear about what it is you're trying to do and in the time frame you're probably trying to do it.
And honest about what's the output required to increase that you can achieve it. Because that's the big gap there. That's usually where we jump past that to like, let's do. Right? Okay, let's do it.
Yeah. And then 3 weeks later, why haven't I lost 60 pounds? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly.
No, this has been great. So how about you? What's next for you? Where do you go from here?
Oh, right. We just finished the MLS season. Unfortunately, we got knocked out of the playoffs. So we're in that growth mindset, debrief, reevaluate the season, evaluate everything that goes on with the club and organization. And what do we need to do to achieve our objectives? We actually were great performance. Really enjoy working in my private practice space. So, whether it be with athletes, sports organizations, individual clients and organizations, I love helping people work through performance strategy. And that's where I spend all my time, and I really enjoy it. So I'm going to continue to work in that space.
That's honest. Well, as I said, I've learned a lot today. I think it's been great. Again, a lot of things you hear in bits and pieces, but you've really brought it together, and I think your book does that as well. Is really brings it together in a way that people can follow the dot and move down the line. So now we go into what I call my rapid fire questions. I'm going to ask you 3 different questions, and that's the first thing that pops into your head. And as an author, I always ask this question: what book has inspired you?
There's many.
I always have a problem with this one too. But
yeah, no, I think it's actually I'd say the one that's put me on a path of, and it's a fiction book. It's The Power of One. By Bryce Courtney. I read it back in early 1990s, and I love the book. It helped me rethink about life and what you go about and why you do what you do. And it's fiction, obviously, but it was an incredible book. I'd say more current book is probably Ray Dalio's Principles. It's a great book. I think
great book.
Fantastic.
Takes a while to get through, though.
Yeah, but I think the first chunk of it is actually probably the really meat of it right there. Okay. It's a great book.
If you can get through that, you're a piece of sailing after that. Yeah, then you're fine. So my second question is, what is your most memorable client interaction? And I guess with you, my client would be then athlete or something. What is your most memorable interaction?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. My most memorable interactions, without a question, whether they be an elite athlete or an individual, is when you're able to connect with that person, help them understand what their why is, and make subtle changes to what they're doing and see that success. Like I really get a high off that, whether it be at the elite performance level or whether it be subtle changes you're helping with someone on their day-to-day life. And you see that potential just come to the forefront.
As I said, it must be very satisfying work, is because it's
incredibly satisfying,
real time, and what works and what doesn't. And the last question is, what is the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
Best piece of advice, one I probably often use with my kids is that reality is 90% perception.
That is the best piece of advice. You make your own reality. I love that one. Hopefully everybody listens to that. So Ben, thank you so much for being on the show. To summarize what I've learned out of this is more or less start with your why. Goal setting is goal setting, but if you really understand why you've set that goal, why it's important to you, why it's important to your family, and be brutally honest if it's something that you're willing to sacrifice. From that, you have to ask yourself, I guess, what outputs are necessary for me to achieve this goal, this objective that we have set, and why it's so important. And then all the tactics to make sure that the right output is created through the right tactics and the right practices that you work on. And you see the great similarities between world-class elite athletics and world-class business entrepreneur and people who are really making a difference in the world. So, as I said, I've learned a lot off of this. Any final words for our audience?
First of all, enjoy the process and really focus on outputs versus outcomes.
I think
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation today.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Ben Sporer, he's the author of Output, Optimizing Your Performance with Lessons Learned from Sport. Excellent book. As I said, I've learned a lot from him today. Ben, once again, thank you very much for being on Turning the Page.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.